Anne Danchenko, City of Fear. Night covered the city like a huge bat. Heavy clouds crawled across the sky, leaving a piece of the moon to observe earthly affairs. But the streets of the city were empty. The windows of the houses fell asleep, as did their inhabitants. Silence spread through all the alleys, crept into the most remote corners, forcing all living things to fall silent, freeze, fall silent. On such nights the most things happen. The moon knew this, and in many centuries of existence, it had never been wrong. It noticed a man who had somehow ended up on the street at such a late hour, and prepared to watch. The man was in a hurry. The silence of the night, almost tangible, frightened him so much that he was afraid to even look back. No, he was not a coward, but the loneliness of the empty streets and the vague outlines of trees and objects emerging from the darkness painted incomprehensible fears in his imagination, making his heart beat faster and his pace quicken. It seemed to the man that at any moment someone would jump out of the darkness and attack him. Inopportunely, chronicles of night incidents seen on television popped up in his head. Memory mercilessly slipped visual images of murdered people whose frozen faces looked like rubber masks pulled tight by death. Death does not beautify anyone, the man thought, and immediately pulled himself up. It was not the time and place to think about it. Some vague sound made the night passerby wary. The heart stopped beating for a moment, and then began to roar with such force that the man could only hear it. Staring intently into the darkness, the man stopped and pressed his back against the house he was passing. His heavy breathing seemed so loud to him that it seemed as if it could be heard for many miles around. The man tried to calm down and pull himself together, but a wave of fear, pumped up by himself, overwhelmed his brain, and it sent impulses to the heart, forcing it to beat faster and faster, and to the nerves, keeping them tense. His eyes peered into the darkness, and his palms felt the roughness of the wall of the house. At some point, the man imagined that his hands had gone deep into the wall. He tried to take them away, but they seemed to have grown to the bricks like his body. The wall decided not to let go of its victim, and quickly, like liquid cement mortar, pulled the man into itself. The man's desperate cry was cut off very quickly, as soon as the cement filled his throat. Silence fell over the street again. Well, death doesn't make anyone look good, Clark said, addressing no one in particular. He looked at the man welded into the wall of the house, like a bizarre decoration molded by a crazy architect. The man's face with bulging eyes was distorted by a grimace of horror in his mouth, open in a silent scream. Part of the wall was visible. His whole pose betrayed a desperate attempt to save himself. It seemed that the man was about to jump out of his strange trap. The police officer looked at the sky, barely touched by the first pale rays of the Sunday. The day would be cloudy. Already an unpleasant grayish fog hung in the air in ragged wisps, filling it with dampness and moisture. "Sergeant, go have some coffee or something," a short, thin boy with a greenish face from the picture he had seen could barely stand on his feet. "What is it, huh?" the sergeant asked in a high falsetto, and Clark seriously doubted that it was his natural voice. Clark didn't answer, pretending to be busy looking for a trash can to throw away his cigarette butt. "What is this?" The officer had been wondering for the last 2 months. Work, Clark, through, and, looking absent-mindedly at the bustling policeman, moved towards the car. There was nothing more for him to do here. Later, when the reports and photographs, the results of the examination would fall on his desk, he would think and analyze, although there was no point in these thoughts. Victim Clark drove calmly. Almost 15 years of driving experience allowed him to watch the road and drive, as they say, on autopilot. It was easiest for the officer to think while driving. Harz is a city so small that it is not easy to find it on a map. High-profile murders happen rarely, mostly on a domestic basis. Harz does not give birth to its own maniacs. In any case, this is what Clark thought a couple of months ago. The first case occurred in March. It was from that time that Officer Victim began to count the strange murders in the city. Then the police were called by a dog walker who found human bones and gold crowns in a puddle during a morning walk. The law enforcement officers who arrived at the scene immediately took the dog walker into custody, because the striking whiteness of the bones suggested that they had been gnawed. In this light, the dog walker and his pet bull terrier looked extremely suspicious. Unfortunately, the investigation showed that neither the dog nor its owner had anything to do with the bones. The results of the forensic examination were more than strange. They showed that the bones and gold crowns had been exposed to acid. Why, and most importantly, who needed to treat the bones with acid, remained an unsolvable mystery for Clark. Since it was not possible to find out where the remains came from and who they belonged to, the case could easily be put in a distant drawer and forgotten, but the strange circumstances of the incident did not give the officer any peace. Thinking, Clark parked the car next to a small cafe. The morning coolness of an unlucky day made him shiver. The gray fog was not going to dissipate yet. It hung in ragged clumps, making the already unremarkable city faceless. The officer tried to quickly go into the establishment and order a double coffee. The body, forcibly raised from bed, required an energy dose for the coming day. Having taken a sip of the scalding drink, Victim Clark returned to his thoughts. The second incident occurred almost a month after the first, but even now the officer could not remember it without shuddering. There was a reason. The police were then called by road workers who discovered a corpse when they came to work early in the morning. Each of them then underwent a long course of rehabilitation. Although one was never able to return to a normal way of life, as far as Clark knows, the worker in a state of complete shock was taken to a psychiatric hospital, where he remains to this day. The spectacle could drive any healthy person crazy. At the roadworks site, where workers were laying brick tiles, the drawing continued with a human corpse, or rather, its parts. The man's body was dismembered into equal bricks and laid out in a random order, like in a kaleidoscope. This picture subsequently haunted the officer for many more nights. It has started again. Again fear walks the night streets. What? The officer didn't immediately understand and looked at the speaker in bewilderment. The old man standing at his table, not very neat in appearance, was well over 80. A stiff gray stubble of many days made his wrinkled, gray, wind, and snow-tanned face look unkempt. Slouched, with the habit of being driven away from everywhere, the old man looked at the officer with the strange gaze of a not very healthy person. Clark did not have time to examine him anymore. "Hey, don't bother, mister," the bartender barked. "I warned you not to stick your nose in here. Go, go, or I'll call the right people for your soul," he said, watching the strange visitor leave. "Who is this?" Clark nodded towards the closed door. "A tramp," the bartender answered readily. "He lives somewhere nearby at the dump. I chase him away from here, so he doesn't scare away my customers." What fear was he talking about? Why listen to him? The poor guy hasn't been right in the head for a long time. The officer nodded absent-mindedly, once again picking up the thread of his thoughts. If Clark had any doubts before, today's incident had dispelled them completely. The first two cases could still be attributed to the actions of some crazy maniac who had appeared in the city. But how could the man in the wall be explained? Who could do that? Clark sighed, looked at the remains of his coffee. Something bad was happening in the city, and something very strange. And that was what worried the police officer the most. Nothing was more frightening than something that could not be explained rationally. Nodding goodbye to the bartender, Clark left the cafe and headed for the car. The working morning had already arrived, and current affairs required his presence at the station. The unpleasant fog was gradually dissipating. Visibility had improved, which made movement safer and easier. The light music on the radio was replaced by the morning news. The officer listened, but not a word was said about the night's incident, which meant that the reporters had not yet learned anything, although victim Clark had no doubt that this news would be the main one in the next issue. Any policeman who had seen the wall picture understood that it would be difficult to hide, much less hush up such a thing. The last news of the issue was a message about an unusual coincidence. According to the radio host, recently only girls have been born in the city, even in cases where the ultrasound showed a male child in the expectant mother. The officer pushed the news out of his head and tried to relax. The day promised to be tense. The man was walking quickly down the street. For some reason, it is at night that even the slowest person quickens their usual pace, trying to reach their destination as quickly as possible. Especially on such a night, quiet and lonely, as if all her admirers had abandoned her at once, like a flighty girl, leaving her yearning for interesting company. The night embraced the houses and trees in an attempt to find affection, quietly stirred the leaves and bushes, and with a cool breeze ran skillful fingers under the clothes of the lonely hurrying man. But the passerby did not like these touches. He cringed and tried to cover his neck with the collar of his jacket, cursing through his teeth at the unlit streets and the clouds that hid the moon. He rather tried to cover up with irritation the fear that was taking hold of his brain more and more with each passing minute. Fear came out of nowhere, blurring the boundaries of common sense and skepticism, making them ghostly, depriving them of logic. The darkness played a melody on the tense nerves that penetrated into the brain cells. Step, another step, another. The man did not hear his own steps, as if the night had turned off the sound, as an unnecessary obstacle to the companion of darkness, silence. Passing by the houses, the man nervously looked at the sky and saw that the clouds had finally parted. "Here is the moon," the traveler rejoiced. The shadow of the building fell on him and crushed him like a cockroach that got under a sleeper at the wrong time. A soft breeze rustled. The night sighed softly. She was not saddened by the man's death. She didn't like him anyway. He, like the others, was in a hurry to leave her alone. The blue lights of the police cars cut through the pre-dawn gloom. Trying to cover his neck with the collar of his jacket, victim Clark hurried to the police concentration area. One look was enough for him to feel the urge to vomit. Only a quick look away and deep breaths helped him avoid an unpleasant situation. "Officer, a doctor?" asked one of the policemen. No need. Let them take it away quickly." The cop nodded. Clark, noticing the medical examiner, moved toward him. "Good morning," he greeted the expert, shaking his hand. "Well, you've gone too far with the kind one. Habit." Clark nodded towards the corpse. "What happened to him?" "To be honest, I don't know." The medical examiner shook his head. "He was crushed by something very heavy." "But what? There are no trucks or other heavy objects nearby." The policeman looked around. "Nothing but this building. Well, as you can see, it's absolutely whole. Not a single piece has fallen off." "Can you tell the time of death?" "Around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning." "I see. Well then, if you have any suggestions, even the most incredible ones, call me at any time." "Okay," agreed. Clark removed his glove to shake the medical examiner's hand in farewell. He knew almost certainly that the medical examiner would have known new information to shed light on this series of strange deaths. Clark's eyes were closing. Even the 5th cup of strong coffee was not helping. Despite the late night, the officer sat in his office and tried to put together all the pieces of the puzzle. His desk was piled high with files on all the strange murders of the last few months. Expert reports, photographs of the victims before and after death. Clark compared the data, but found no common denominators. The victims were of different ages, different social statuses. They worked at different jobs, had no mutual acquaintances, and had never crossed paths. The only thing they had in common was gender. All the victims were men. Clark would take a photograph or file of one of the victims and stare and read for a long time until his eyes began to close. It started again. Again fear roams the night streets. The dirty old man stretched out his shaking hands towards him. "What are you talking about? What fear?" Clark tried to ask him, but the old man dissolved into a milky fog, leaving only a dying, barely understandable muttering. A sharp sound woke Clark. He looked at the fallen folder and realized that he had fallen asleep right on his desk. Massaging his stiff neck, he watched out the window for a few minutes as the sky on the horizon turned pink. Clark felt like he had missed something important, something that could help him. Stupid dream. Why do I keep dreaming about that tramp? What was he muttering? Fear is stalking the streets again, I think. Clark froze, so as not to scare away the sudden clue. Again, the key word. Why hadn't he thought of this before? Maybe something like this had happened before. There weren't many chances, but the officer didn't want to miss any opportunity, so he spent the next few hours in the archives. Victim Clark had been convinced more than once that life was a master at presenting the most amazing surprises, but today it had amazed even him. The policeman was driving along the still empty streets of the morning, where only occasionally he came across sleepy passersby, whose working day began earlier than usual. Clark was immersed in thought. He considered himself lucky. In the archive, he came across cases from 55 years ago. Several deaths of men were more than strange, and very much reminded the policeman of those that he had led. At that time, the same investigator, Willan Wayne, was investigating all these cases. As it turned out, Wayne left the police the same year as the deaths occurred. All the cases were closed, recognizing the deaths as accidents. Clark called Wayne's relatives, but it turned out that the former policeman had gone missing 55 years ago. Clark looked at Willan Wayne's photo from his personal file and could not believe his eyes. And if it weren't for his professional memory, having stopped the car near the already familiar cafe, Clark got out of the car, glancing at the sign. Letta is a good name for a drinking establishment. The policeman chuckled to himself. There was no one in the cafe at this early hour, only a sleepy bartender wiping glasses with a towel. "Good morning," Clark greeted the owner. "Same to you." "Coffee?" "Yes, black." "I see you don't have many visitors this morning." "It's still early," the bartender replied, placing a steaming cup in front of Clark. "By 8:30, the Clarks will be going out for a cup of coffee before work." "Thank you." Victim thanked him and, as if by the way, asked, "Does that old tramp not come to see you anymore?" "Of course. He was hanging around here just yesterday, but I quickly sent him away. I value my reputation, you know." "And where does he live, you say?" "At the dump, which is behind the neighboring street." "Why?" "No, he just seemed familiar to me." "I think he used to live next door," Clark made up on the fly. "What are you saying? How life breaks people, huh?" The bartender shook his head. "You're right. Thanks for the coffee. Now I can go to work. The policeman smiled. Have a nice day. Closing the door of the cafe behind him, Clark thought that today luck was perhaps finally on his side. She had deceived him. Luck had only teased him, allowing him to grab it for a moment. But then it had disappeared, leaving only a taste of disappointment. He realized this when, after a few minutes of searching, he found the dump that the owner of Summer had talked about. It was no different from dozens of others in the city. Piles of garbage in and around the containers, scraps of newspapers that the wind was weakly stirring, dirty and hopeless, so much so that you want to leave as soon as possible without defiling yourself with this place. Clark was going to do just that, seeing nothing but garbage. But after taking a few steps, he noticed a large pile of rags that were lying not far from the containers. Disgustedly moving the dirty rags with the toe of his boot, the officer found what he was looking for. A familiar tramp lay motionless in worn-out rags, former policeman Willan Wayne. It took Clark a few seconds to realize that the man lying there was dead. The body was covered in green mold, and in places there were wounds that looked very much like someone's bites. There were scraps of food, opened cans, even an old bent fork, and a rusty knife lying around the body. Clark examined the body as best he could, but found no signs of violent death other than the bites. Of course, the policeman would call in a task force, and the medical examiner would determine the cause of the tramp's death. But for some reason, the officer was sure that Willan Vine's death was another in a series of strange events. In at least one way, victim Clark was lucky. The relatives of former police officer Willan Wayne were still living at 6 Elm Street, just as they had been 55 years earlier. The door was opened by an elderly but pleasant, well-groomed woman who introduced herself as Wayne's daughter. "Unfortunately, my mother is no longer alive," she answered the officer's question, "but I will try to help you." Clark sat in the living room of a cozy house, sipping coffee offered by the hostess and carefully asking questions. "Yes, my father worked as a policeman. To be honest, I don't remember him well, because when he left home, I was very little." "When did this happen?" "Right after my father quit the police. I don't know why he did it. This act, as well as his subsequent departure from home, remained a mystery to my mother and me. We tried so many times to understand the reasons that pushed my father to do this, because our family was close-knit, so everything we could assume was somehow connected with his work." "Did he tell you about her?" "No. Mom said that in the last year before he left, Dad worked a lot, came home worried, and gradually withdrew into himself more and more." "Do you remember the day he left?" "It was October 31, 1948. The day before my father came in gloomy. He hardly spoke to anyone and did not answer questions. And on October 31, he left silently and has not appeared since then. Of course, we reported to the police, looked for him, but all in vain. The only thing we could find out was that the last time my father was seen was the day after at the funeral of a local priest. A priest? Your father was a religious man? No, not really. To be honest, he rarely went to church, and only at his mother's insistence. His father always said that he preferred to sit in front of the TV with a can of beer on Sundays rather than listen to dreary masses. You never saw him again? No. Although, several times my mother and I noticed that someone was standing in the bushes behind the fence. But when we went out to look, no one was there. Tell me, did your father keep any records or diaries? He did. After he left, Mom looked for the black notebook he hid from her. She thought she could find answers to the questions that tormented us in it, but the notes disappeared. We were never able to find them. Apparently, Dad took the notebook with him. Tell me, why are you so interested in my father? Do you know anything about him? Clark was embarrassed. He decided that he would not be the one to tell the woman about her father's death, but he was not going to lie either. So he decided to act as usual, to tell only that part of the truth that did not harm anyone. It's just that I'm currently handling a number of cases that are very similar to those your father handled before he was fired. I thought that he or his notes could help me. The woman shook her head. Alas, unfortunately, there is nothing left. I'm very sorry, Mr. Victim. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me. I'm sorry to disturb your memories and Mrs. Ritchie, if by any chance, if I remember anything, I'll definitely let you know. The woman smiled understandingly. All Saints Church was the only one in Hearts, so Victim Clark went there without thinking twice. He had only one lead, the priest's funeral, where Willan Vane was last seen. The fact that an impious policeman came to the funeral of a Holy Father seemed strange to Clark. The officer could not shake off the thought that all the events in that distant year of 48 were directly connected. Perhaps a visit to the church would clarify some circumstances. The officer had chosen a good time, as he had expected. There were no services in the church at that hour, so there were few people there. Clark had not been here for a long time, so he walked around the church for a few minutes before approaching the priest. Holy Father? The priest turned around. Yes, I'm listening to you. Clark showed his ID. I need your help. Of course, officer. But if it concerns the secrecy of confession, then, alas, I cannot help in any way. I have told your colleagues this more than once. No, Holy Father, I understand you. It's not about confession. I need information about the priest who served here more than 55 years ago. Oh, unfortunately, I wasn't even born then. Perhaps the only one who can help you is the church archivist. His books contain the names of all the ministers of our church, and he himself is quite old. Perhaps he remembers something himself. Where can I find him? I'll take you. Let's go. As it turned out, the church archive was located in an extension next to the church itself. The old gray-haired archivist spent a long time looking for the necessary entry in the dusty church books, but according to them, not a single minister of the Church of All Saints was buried in November 1948. Are you sure that this is a record of all the priests of this church? Clark asked the archivist. Just in case. Yes, of course. I personally keep these records and I know my job well. The officer looked at the page again. Suddenly, his gaze was drawn to a name with the notation excommunicated next to it. What does this entry mean? The archivist peered through his glasses at the line. Jekyll Hyde. He was excommunicated from the church in July 1948. For what? The old attendant did not answer right away. He took off his glasses, wiped them for a long time, but finally, with a sigh, he answered the question. Jekyll Hyde killed 31 women. All of them were pregnant. The police officer barely restrained himself from whistling. This news shocked even him. Sorry, but this is punishable not only by excommunication, but also by the electric chair. Jekyll Hyde was declared mentally ill and placed in a hospital, where he died later that year. At the end of October, the archivist thought, yes, it was in the fall, if my memory serves me right. But was it in October? I don't remember. Forgive me. Do you remember Jekyll Hyde himself? Yes, you know very well. I had just come to All Saints Church. Jekyll Hyde immediately made a great impression on me, and to this day, I confess, I have never met a more devout person in my entire life, and believe me, I have seen many of them. Jekyll Hyde was a true, zealous Catholic. He devoted all his time only to serving God. This was the meaning of his life. Who knew that this faith would take away his mind? How did he explain his murders? Hyde claimed that the Antichrist was about to be born in hearts and considered it the lesser evil to kill all the pregnant women in the city than to allow the absolute evil to be born. I see. And the last question. Is Jekyll Hyde buried in the church cemetery? Oh, no. Oh, come on. After Hyde was excommunicated from the church, everyone tried to forget that he was a priest. You understand what a blow to his reputation, that island. No, of course he will. The archivist shook his head. Jekyll Hyde is buried in a cemetery outside the city. After visiting the church, Clark felt like he understood even less about what was going on than before. Flint Butcher carefully closed the door of his office behind him. This action made Clark look in surprise at the pathologist's worried face. Always cheerful and carefree, Flint usually burst into his old friend's office, opening the door with his foot, as they say, and not particularly worried about whether it closed behind him. Have a seat, Clark belatedly suggested when Butcher had already pulled a chair up to the table and sat down. Flint placed the folder in front of him and looked expectantly at Victim. "Don't touch me." He slapped Clark's hands when he shrugged and tried to take the documents Flint had brought. "Isn't this the conclusion, according to Wayne? It Ireland, but you won't find anything interesting in it." "I'm interested in the cause of death. I'll tell you that. A heart attack," Butcher replied and stared at Clark again. Victim knew his friend too well to realize that something was wrong. "So what? And what's here?" Flint tapped the folder. "Will not say that the heart rupture most likely occurred due to insane fear, nor that the wounds resembling bites contain residues of substances characteristic of food products. Didn't understand? If we lived in a world where nothing was impossible, I would say that he was bitten by food." Clark looked at his friend for a few seconds, digesting his words, then laughed uncontrollably and desperately, feeling the tension and anxiety of the last few days disappear. Such an awkward joke became the apogee of the absurdities that accompanied Clark during the investigation of these cases. So everything that had happened before seemed like nonsense generated by his imagination. If it weren't for the strange death, Victim became serious again. "Gone?" Flint, who hadn't smiled once the entire time, asked, and after waiting for Clark to nod, continued. "What are you doing, buddy? What kind of cases are you investigating? This isn't the first strange corpse, is it?" "Oh," the officer waved his hand. "Don't worry about it. You'll sleep better." "That's exactly what I'll do. I wish the same for you." Flint looked at Clark intently. "Drop this business, buddy. Give it to someone else, or better yet, close it altogether. It won't end well. You'll either end up in a mental hospital or something else." Butcher didn't dare finish. "And let the death continue in the meantime? No, you can't just get rid of it. Besides, I don't think I'm in any danger, but the mental hospital is close. I've lost my desire to visit the city psychiatric clinic." And, noticing Flint's wary look, he laughed and added, No, for now only for professional purposes." Officer Victim had never been to a mental hospital before, and all his ideas about the place were limited to the impressions he had seen in movies. He knew it was stupid to expect violent lunatics banging their heads against the walls in hysterics, but he hadn't expected to see such peace and quiet either. In the hospital corridor, he met only a few patients, some of whom didn't pay any attention to him, while others, on the contrary, followed him with their eyes or even followed him. This unhealthy behavior made Clark nervous, so he was determined to sort out the affairs of the hospital as quickly as possible. Fortunately, the nurse on duty was understanding and efficient, and soon Jekyll Hyde's medical history was lying before the police officer. "I would ask you not to leave. I'm afraid I can't overcome this on my own," he smiled at the sweet nurse. "Yes, of course, I will try to help you. I'm interested in when and under what circumstances. Jekyll Hyde ended up in this clinic. 1 minute. The girl lived through the medical history, stopping at the right places. Patient Haight was admitted to the clinic on August 1, 1948 by a court order based on the conclusion of a forensic medical examination on the mental state of the suspect. Did he undergo treatment? Not completely. I just didn't have time. On the night of November 1st, Haight died in his ward. Cause of death? Choking. Jekyll Hyde was asthmatic. Really? Clark was surprised. Why didn't he take his medicine or call a doctor? The nurse shrugged. Maybe he didn't have time. Tell me, does the file say whether anyone visited the patient? Access to the patient was limited, so there were almost no visitors. Only 2 people visited Hyde regularly. Police officer William Wayne and Wayne? You said Wayne? Clark asked. The nurse looked at the file again. Yes, William Wayne. The last time he visited the patient, according to records, was on the day of his death. This is news, Clark muttered. What did you say? The nurse didn't understand. No, I do it for myself. The officer was silent for a few minutes, digesting the information and trying to put the facts together, but he realized that this would take much more time and decided to put off thinking about it for later. You said that 2 people visited Haight regularly? He asked the nurse again. Who was the other? His wife. The darkness tiptoed after the man, step by step, not lagging behind. It liked this game. The man would look back, but there would be no one behind him. He wouldn't see it. For him, it would be nothing, emptiness. But the darkness was offended by this. It and emptiness were 2 very different things. For example, who had ever seen fog in emptiness? No one. But night fog was a rare phenomenon, but it did exist. In any case, it definitely existed tonight. A milky cloud enveloped the road and the trees almost to the very top, leaving only the dark tops to block out the pale moon. The foggy landscape seemed like a haze, a black and white photograph. The man hurrying into the night did not like black and white art. He preferred bright colors, but the darkness and fog tried to convince him otherwise. They mixed like coffee with cream, giving the surrounding landscape a muddy gray hue. A foggy mist enveloped the feet of the passersby, begging him not to leave, gently pressing against his cheeks, tickling his nose. Damn, what weather! Disgusting. The man paused for a moment and tried to light a cigarette, but after several unsuccessful attempts, he threw away the damp matchbox. He noticed his fingers were shaking, but he could not admit to himself that it was not only from the night chill. Suddenly, it seemed to him that someone had grabbed his leg. He jerked, quickened his steps. Then, without realizing it, he began to run. The cool air was scratching his nose and throat, but this did not sober the man up. The faster he ran, the more afraid he became, as if he felt that as soon as he stopped, something invisible would overtake him. The runner heard only his own hoarse breathing, but no sane flashes of consciousness could stop him. The darkness was tired of racing, but it didn't like losing. That night, it and the fog made a deal. A white cloud wrapped itself around the man's neck. He fell to his knees and began gasping for air, but no matter how many times he tried, it only got worse. A few moments later, the man fell to the side, his eyes and mouth still wide open. "What is it this time?" Clark asked the medical examiner, who was busy with the body. The man looked at the officer with slight surprise, who, having approached, did not even say hello. He extended his hand to him. "Good morning, officer. Frankly, you don't look well." Clark barely restrained himself from cursing. Morning calls to murder scenes had become almost routine. "Yes, hello. Don't pay attention. Lots of work. Haven't been sleeping well lately." "Not surprising." "Another corpse." He nodded at the lineman. "Doesn't exactly contribute to a good night's sleep." "What did he die of?" "I can't say for sure right now, but it's most likely strangulation." "Murder?" "Unlikely." Note that there are no traces of impact on the victim's neck. Clark looked at the man lying there. His face was unnaturally blue, his eyes and mouth open. He looked unpleasant, but certainly much better than the victims of the previous cases. The officer looked at his neck and, indeed, saw no marks. "So, nothing again?" Clark said, feeling the irritation building up, more affirmatively than questioningly. The medical examiner spread his hands helplessly. Without even saying goodbye, the officer headed for the car, barely containing the anger that was bursting to get out. Several months of fruitless searching had not brought him any closer to solving the mystery. On the contrary, they had only confused him more. Clark was tired of feeling like a dog who had been waved a piece of sausage in front of his nose and left to search for its vanished spirit. Not yet knowing how, the officer decided that he would stop the damn deaths. After a moment's hesitation, Clark tried to light a cigarette, but after several unsuccessful attempts, he threw away the damp matchbox in irritation, followed by an unlit cigarette. The morning light flooded the church archives so brightly that one could see the dust particles flying smoothly, almost lazily, in the air. The old man was rummaging through the shelves of the cabinet, and the sun's rays illuminated the top of his head like a transparent halo. The halo swayed slightly when the archivist was distracted from his work by an unexpected voice. "Good morning," Clark greeted. "Officer Victim. I see you an early bird. I have two. Service." Clark glanced around the room as usual, but didn't notice anything new since his last visit. "So, you're talking about Haight again? More precisely, about his wife. Haight was married, wasn't he?" The old archivist nodded. "Yes, I was. But you won't be able to talk to her. She's been with the Almighty for a long time." This time, victim Clark wasn't even surprised. He was surprised if he'd been lucky. The officer looked hopelessly at the short old man. "Does Haight have any other relatives left?" The archivist looked away and began aimlessly sorting through some sheets of paper on the table with his dry, old hands. Officer, why stir up the past? The man is gone, and his sins are gone with him. Why disturb the memory? Unfortunately, sometimes the future demands that we solve the mysteries of the past and does not give us peace until this happens. The old man nodded. Yes, I understand. I understand. Jekyll Hyde has a son whom he never saw. At the time of his death, his wife was only pregnant. Clark's heart stopped beating for a second, but he ordered himself not to delude himself. More than once, a seemingly strong thread had led him back to the same untangled ball. Do you know anything about him? Look, officer, he didn't know his father. How can he help you? I don't know yet, victim said honestly, but I have no other leads. The archivist remained silent. So, do you know where I can find the younger Hyde? He is closer than you think. Junior Hyde, as you put it, followed in his father's footsteps and became a priest. He serves in our church. Do you remember the Holy Father with whom you came here the first time? He? Clark asked, afraid to breathe. The ways of the Lord are inscrutable, officer, but he always leaves signs along our path. I have nothing more to say. I think the rest of the questions are not for me. Clark rolled down the car window to let the night coolness refresh his face. It was the dead of night. The officer had waited for this on purpose, so that no random person would see what victim was about to do. In order not to fall asleep, Clark once again played over in his head the conversation with Hitty's son. He remembered how excited he had been before the meeting from the possibility, if not to put an end to it, then at least to get out of the vicious circle. On the way to the church, he had even unbuttoned the top buttons of his shirt. It seemed to him that the collar was pressing, the blood was rushing to his head, and it was becoming more difficult to breathe. He was afraid to scare away his gaping luck and frantically tried to grasp the solution faster than it would again have time to dissolve in a series of strange events. But the conversation with Hyde's son, contrary to expectations, yielded almost nothing. He managed to find Jekyll Hyde's son almost immediately. Thinking about how to start the conversation, Clark slowed his pace, but the Holy Father noticed him himself. Officer, do you remember me? I have a good memory for faces. The priest smiled kindly. He had a friendly appearance, an open look, and a pleasant smile. Clark liked him. I'd like to talk to you, Clark paused, about your father. The Holy Father looked down, and before he looked up again, Clark had time to notice that the priest looked good for his age. The way people looked who lived in harmony with themselves and the world around them. My father passed away a month before I was born, the man replied, as he looked at the officer again with clear blue eyes. Did your mother tell you about him? In our family, we tried not to touch on this topic. My mother gave me her last name so that nothing would indicate kinship. We lived almost as recluses for many years, until those terrible events began to be forgotten by people. You don't know what connected your father and Willan Wayne. Willan Wayne? The policeman who handled your father's case. He, like your mother, visited Hyde in the hospital. What? No, I don't know anything about that. I can't help you at all. Sorry, officer. Clark left the priest completely at a loss. He sat at the station again, going through the files and trying to solve the puzzle over and over again. He intuitively, like a trained dog, felt that there was something that connected Hyde and Wayne, but the puzzle was missing pieces, and without them he could not solve the problem. Now the officer was driving along the night road to the cemetery where the former priest was buried. Victim himself did not know what he was going to look for there, and whether it was all pointless, but nothing else came to mind. He rolled down the window in time. His eyes were closing in the sultry summer night, but the night breeze cleared his cloudy head a little. The cemetery was not that far from the town, but Clark was in no hurry, knowing from experience that accidents happen precisely when attention is weakened by the calm of deserted roads. Having stopped the car at the gate, the officer took the prepared shovel and flashlight from the trunk and went deeper into the cemetery. The darkness of the deep night hid the features of the graves and their fences. The crosses and tombstones acquired outlines only upon approach. Clark perceived the cemetery as everyday. Perhaps that is why he did not pay attention to the natural rustles and shadows that frighten more impressionable visitors to this place. The officer had been here many times and knew the order of the graves. Nevertheless, he had to wonder before he found an inconspicuous tombstone on which only the name of Jekyll Hyde and the years of his birth and death were carved. Before proceeding with his plan, Clark once again asked himself whether this was not pointless. What he expected to see in a coffin with the remains of a long-dead person, whether it was worth his diligence, and whether it would not be easier to conduct an official exhumation. However, Clark had almost no doubt about the latter, since he knew the futility of such a request to the judge. He found no arguments in favor of the need to exhume the body. The sudden death of Hyde and the presence at Wayne's funeral were all he had. First, he looked at the dark sky, where the stars were almost invisible because of the clouds. Then he looked down at the grave and chuckled to himself, thinking that people have strange logic. Dreaming of getting to heaven, they bury bodies in the ground. Having adjusted the lantern so that the circle of light fell on the place where he was going to dig, the officer gripped the shovel tighter and began to work. By the time Clark managed to dig up the coffin, he was pretty exhausted, taking short breaks several times to rub his aching back, regretfully noting that physical labor had become much more difficult for him lately. After taking a final break and wiping the sweat from his neck, Victim began to carefully pry the coffin lid off with a shovel. Time and the damp soil had done their job, and a little effort was enough to make the rotten boards come off. Clark had reached his goal. Officer Victim had been present at exhumations in his career, so the sight that unfolded before him was nothing new. In the light of the flashlight, Clark saw human bones in decaying rags. Moving the beam of light along the skeleton, the policeman came across a foreign object peeking out from under the rags. Bending down, he carefully pulled out the find. Looking at the book in a dark binding, Clark at first decided that it was a Bible, but when he opened the cover, he saw handwritten notes. The pages were in poor condition. The words were difficult to read, so Victim did not waste time putting the book aside. He carefully examined the coffin again, but saw nothing else of interest. Having somehow put the lid back on, the policeman began to hastily throw earth into the hole. In the east, the sky was already turning red. A satisfied smile never left Victim Clark's face. This time his intuition had not failed him. It was quiet and dark. No one, no people, no animals. The weak light of the moon did not allow one to drown in the darkness between the houses without a trace. But it was barely enough to avoid running into the walls that squeezed in from both sides, giving only a narrow tunnel for passage. There should be an exit at the end, but it was blocked by a grate. It was not locked and opened easily, letting one forward. There was an open space there, which made it lighter, so light that you could see the garbage cans. Rats were scurrying around in the garbage next to them. A gust of wind blew away a newspaper that was covering something. The dark pile stirred, and a man rose from the ground with a groan. He looked around sleepily, scratched his neck behind the collar, scraping something out. Damn lice. The voice was old and hoarse. He coughed. He reached for a nearby bottle and took a few sips. Ahem. It's kind of tedious. The old man massaged his chest in the area of his heart. He looked around again. Nothing. Darkness and silence, diluted by the rustling of rats. Those bastards. There's no escape from them, the tramp said angrily. Oh, my heart is pounding. My stomach is cramping. Is it from hunger? He reached for the bag and folded the newspaper. He took the hamburger, bit into it, chewed slowly. He took another sip from the bottle. Swallowing with difficulty, he began to breathe noisily. My heart is beating. Is it really time? A scream. The bitten-off hamburger dug into the hand that held it. The old man unclenched his fingers, but the bun did not fall, clinging to his hand. A tin can scratched his leg with its jagged lid. A rotten apple rolled toward him. A few seconds later, the tramp fell to the ground with his last hoarse breath. The wind covered the old man's face with a newspaper. Clark opened his eyes abruptly. He was breathing heavily, and his heart was pounding as if it was demanding that his chest let it out. Despite the fact that Victim immediately realized that this was a dream, he could not calm down. He wiped the sweat from his face with his hand. Damn butcher, Clark said angrily. Turning over the digital clock on the nightstand, he saw that it was past 2 in the morning. Clark whistled. He had been exhausted by the last few days. He had slept for almost a day. Leaning back on the pillow, Victim tried to put his thoughts in order. It was hot in the bedroom. He got out of bed, went to the window and opened it, but it did not help at all. The night was stuffy, like before a heavy rain. The man turned to the bed, but he did not feel like sleeping anymore. The room smelled unpleasantly of rot, and he did not have to look for the reason for this for long. His gaze fell on the black book lying on the nightstand. He had not opened it since the night before, when he took Jekyll Hyde out of the coffin. Yesterday's fatigue knocked him off his feet as soon as he arrived home. Now he simply could not wait to open and read the mysterious notebook. Reaching for it, Clark noticed how his hands were shaking. The thought of smoking to calm down flashed through his mind, but curiosity was stronger. The officer took the half-rotten book and, settling down on the bed, began to read. It was hard. The pages had turned yellow and were so worn that they easily tore off the cover. The notes were almost erased. But Clark realized from the first lines that he was holding William Vane's missing diary in his hands. For 5 days, police officer victim Clark lived as if two entities were fighting inside him. One was trying to be the same Clark he had been all his life and pretend that nothing had happened. The other was rushing around in his locked consciousness and trying to break out. It was breaking down the thin partitions of sober reason with nightmares, persistent doubts, and the endless throbbing of obsessive thoughts in his temples. On the evening of the 5th day, Clark, putting on his holster and covering it with his jacket, left the house. Hyde's words were confirmed. Hyde was indeed founded in 1282, 666 years ago. It was just a coincidence, and the sick mind immediately saw a sign in this. "The number of the beast," said Hyde. "It is written in the Bible." I also checked the information on maternity hospitals. On the day the Hyde murders began, there were 666 pregnant women registered. This doesn't mean anything. Some may simply not have registered yet. Victim decided not to take the car, despite the fact that it was a long way to go. He gave himself a chance to change his mind, to convince his rebellious consciousness of the absurdity of the idea, but his pragmatic mind was silent, as if all his arguments would be doomed in advance, and his memory, against the will of its owner, stubbornly flashed before his eyes the lines that were forever welded in, word for word. Another death tonight, a drowned man in the middle of a city where there is not a single body of water for 80 miles. The medical examiner said the water in the lungs was rain. Yes, it rained last night, but no one could recall a case where a person choked on rain. Oh, and also, I just noticed today, all the victims are male. They have nothing in common. No age, no occupation, no mutual acquaintances, except that they are all men. I don't want to think about it, but they all die in the same places where Hyde killed his victims. Coincidence? Clark approached the house when the dark blue ink of twilight, mixing with the purple sunset, painted the sky in an indefinite, dirty, alarming color. Under the dark clouds rolling over the city, birds were screaming warningly, foreshadowing a strong wind. Hearts, bristling with houses, sullen as an old man, was preparing for the night. He is an asthmatic. If he doesn't take his medicine in time, he'll quickly suffocate. It's simple. All I have to do is quietly take his medicine away, and everything else will happen on its own. This will be the most terrible thing I've ever done, despite the fact that my guesses are right. They must be right. But I'll have to choose between two evils. The gun barrel was pointed at the priest's forehead. He was sleeping, and Clark prayed that he would not wake up until the very end. Victim was not worried about the Holy Father seeing him. He did not want the man to feel the horror of what was going to happen to him, because everyone is afraid of death. It is at the level of instinct. You can wait for it, be humble, and believe that you will get to heaven. But when you see the black hole of the barrel, then your whole eye, suddenly finding itself so small and insignificant, is drawn into this blackness. And at this moment, this is not an entrance to the next world. This is an exit from this one. That's it. I did it. In a few hours, maybe sooner, maybe later, but soon Jekyll Hyde will be dead, unless, of course, some accident interferes. But I don't think there will be any accident. Lately, I've stopped believing in them altogether. Everything that happens is natural. One follows from another, another from a third. We just don't always see the causal connections. Sometimes they are so ghostly and inexplicable that it seems to us that they do not exist and cannot exist. If the pragmatic mind did not put a damper on the path to our consciousness, we would have gone crazy long ago from the flow of the unreal that is next to us and around us. Sometimes it seems to me that it is not the unreality around us, but we are in it, and we are trying to build our own laws, not realizing that they have long existed, regardless of our understanding of them. Victim Clark walked away from the priest's house along a dark path with puddles glittering in the moonlight. The Holy Father had not woken up, and Clark could not choose between two evils. And he was also sure that there is not only one way out, it is just much more difficult to find the other. The officer walked along the mirror puddles and, mentally leafing through the entries in Wayne's diary, tried to understand where he missed the turn to the emergency exit. Why does history repeat itself again? After all, every effect has a cause. Strange deaths are a cause. The murder of a priest is an effect. Or is it the other way around? The priest is the cause, and the deaths are an effect. By killing the priest, the deaths will stop. But why did they start? Is the Holy Father interfering? What is it? Clark stopped. Who? A sharp pain pierced his spine. Clark immediately stopped feeling his limbs, as if they had gone numb. The pain twisted his nerves so that he couldn't breathe. His eyes bulged out of their sockets, and he caught his breath. Something foreign was growing along his back, as if it wanted to become a second spine. Clark was torn off the ground, and as if impaled on a stake, he hung on a young sprouted tree. Its shoots, growing along his arms, stretched them to the sides, and thin branches, breaking through the body, quickly swelled with buds, and sticky leaves did not hesitate to appear. But in the deceptive moonlight, they looked like lumps of dark dried blood. The last thing victim Clark heard in his life, with his fading consciousness, held on by pain like an electric current, was the rustle of young leaves in his ear, like a whisper. The city never reveals its secrets to anyone. When it was all over, the moon wrapped itself indifferently in the clouds. It was alone, but there were many people, one more, one less. Cover image from free stock photo Pixabay, suitable for commercial use. No attribution required.